civil societies organizations, Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, uh, MENA Rights Group, uh, Right Realization Center, Bahrain Center for Human Rights, Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, and MENA. We jointly follow up the Bahrain human rights conditions in so many occasions, and we are actively monitoring the human rights conditions in the Gulf, in MENA region in general, and specifically in Bahrain. We would like to take this opportunity with regards of two occasions. One, Bahrain midterm UPR, Universal Periodical Review, within the previous days and coming days, which Bahrain submitted their national midterm UPR report in October last year, 2024, to the Human Rights Council sessions and presented in a side events, and jointly for NGOs, Salam for Democracy and Human Rights, MENA, MENA Rights Group, and Right Realization Center jointly, they submitted their shadow reports or parallel reports to indicate them the midterm UPR. At the same time, in the occasion of Bahrain uprisings, after 14 years of this uprising, which occurred in 14 February 2011, we think that it is good opportunity for us to focus of the issue of the human rights in Bahrain and analyze it in all directions. And today with me, my other colleagues gonna present their view over this types of the analyzing, evaluating the human rights in Bahrain and providing certain recommendation to all stakeholders. I have with me here six panelists, six speakers. All of them are expert and specialized in their field with analyzing of the human rights conditions in Bahrain. Said Youssef, are your videos on? I cannot see you here. Maybe till you become available with us, I can start with the first panelist and first speaker, Dr. Andrew McIntosh. He is a researcher and PhD holder in the media history. He's human rights defenders and been involved in the analyzing the human rights conditions in the Gulf, specifically in Bahrain, more than 6 to 7 years. He already engaged in a lot of reports and articles, and the same time research with regards of the human rights conditions and analyzing the democratic process in the Gulf region. So I welcome Dr. Andrew McIntosh, and he's going to be our first speaker. Well, he can focus over the midterm report submitted, as I indicated, with with three other NGOs, including Salam, in last December. So if you can start, Andrew, and you have 7 to 8 minutes to make a presentation, and the rest of the colleague, they will do the same as the first round. Then we'll go to the second round. They have 3 to 4 minutes. Please go ahead, Dr. Andrew.
Certainly. What I had hoped to do specifically with looking at the UPR and its midterm report here for 2025 and 2024 is looking specifically at how infractions on civil and political rights have affected Bahrain and more or less the kind of reform that we have seen in the country since 2011 and 2012. Essentially, what we've seen when it comes to rhetoric, advertising, public relations from Bahrain has a great deal to do with creating the image of perpetual reform within the country. Yet one of the things we continue to see when we do analysis is that reform is not really manifesting, or at least not in the ways in which other countries are recommending. For example, throughout UPR cycles, Bahrain has continuously supported recommendations from France, Italy, Canada, Morocco, Switzerland, Norway, the United Kingdom, and the United States to strengthen freedom of speech, press, and expression. However, most legislation criminalizing the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly remain in place at this time. directly contravening Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states that all citizens have the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs directly or through freely chosen representatives, to vote and be elected at genuine periodic elections, and to have access on general terms of equality public service in the country. The government continues to use harsh policies to detain Bahrainis for taking part in peaceful protests, or even acts as innocuous as making social media posts criticizing the government, the state, or the monarchy. The government has taken no measures at this time to engender a free, independent press. Media remains tightly regulated. The last independent newspaper in Bahrain was forced to close down in 2017. Domestically, Ministry of Information Affairs personnel monitor media reports on religious sects, national security, criticism of the ruling family or the judiciary, and the Saudi royal family. Government officials have directly contacted the editors of Bahraini newspapers and instructed them to stop publishing articles on certain subjects. Likewise, international news media sources associated with the opposition are typically blocked in the country. Bahraini law currently forbids any speech that authorities consider a challenge to public order or morals, while individuals often express critical opinions regarding domestic, political, and social issues in private. Those who share such opinions publicly, including in traditional or social media, often face harsh repercussions from the state. Throughout 2024, the government took steps against what it considers to be acts of civil disobedience, including critical speech. These restrictions on information, which Bahrain supported remedying at the UPR, have only worsened in recent years. A permit is required to hold demonstrations. A variety of restrictions make it difficult to organize a legal gathering in practice, however. Participants can face long jail terms, particularly if demonstrations involve clashes with security personnel, even if it is not the fault of protesters. Police regularly use force, such as using batons, tear gas, and rubber bullets to break up political protests, most of which occur in Shia majority villages outside of the capital of Manama. Throughout UPR cycles, Bahraini activists have been summoned or arrested for partaking in peaceful protests or even criticizing authorities on social media, with activists having their phones and computers infected with advanced spyware like Pegasus, violating Article 17 of the ICCPR, which guarantees the right to privacy. In March 2023, four men were arrested for abusing social media platforms in the lead up to the Interparliamentary Union. This included Ibrahim al-Manai, a lawyer and prominent activist who posted on Twitter that the Bahraini government should reform its parliament if they are interested in highlighting the Bahraini parliament to the world. In December 2023, activist and former head of opposition party WAD, Ibrahim Sharif, was arrested for a series of social media posts he made criticizing the Bahraini government and its participation in the coalition led by the United States in the Gulf of Aden. Throughout 2024, numerous Shia imams, eulogists, and religious scholars were summoned for interrogation or arrested for publicly condemning the war. That's the normalization of relations between Bahrain and Israel, or bringing attention to poor conditions in Jaw Central Prison, particularly in relation to prisoners of conscience. While restricted media freedom and a hostile environment for members of civil society, there are still considerable obstacles to elections being free, fair, and in alignment with Article 25 of the ICCPR, which remained in place in Britain to this day, in Bahrain to this day, despite supporting recommendations. Bahrain's largest opposition parties, Al-Wafaq and Wad, remain banned. In 2018, political isolation laws, which were passed, explicitly target members of previously dissolved political groups and activists, barring them from running for political office, partaking in civil society organizations, or acting as the heads of firms. An estimated 6,000 to 11,000 individuals are affected by this legislation, including many of Bahrain's most educated and politically experienced from parliament or any other form of civil society. The consequences of this exclusion are already apparent. Salam DHR's recent report on Bahrain, Advancing Democracy, found that MPs frequently did not understand their responsibilities or properly utilize parliamentary procedures. Moreover, the absence of political blocs has greatly hindered collaboration and solidarity among lawmakers, allowing dissenting voices to be isolated and punished without resistance. This was the case for Sunni MP Mohammed al-Husseini. Shortly after calling for the release of political prisoners in Bahrain in the House of Representatives, his title as MP was revoked on the grounds that he had a second nationality. He was then stripped of his Bahraini citizenship and deported to Pakistan shortly afterwards. Because Bahraini citizenship is only translated through the mail and can be retroactively revoked, Al Husseini's wife had to publicly plead for clemency from King Hamad to spare their children the same fate as their father. Conducting surveys with the Bahraini public, Salam DHR found that these considerable deficits in parliament have damaged public trust in elected officials and the democratic system in the country, where people continue to call for reform but feel it often falls on deaf ears. The government's sensitivity to any conversation on prisoners of conscience and the ability to intimidate most domestic parties into silence indicates its enduring centralized power in the country. It has lauded acts over the past years, such as pardoning 1,107 prisoners occurred via royal decree instead of act of democratic consensus. Moreover, the majority of those released were not prisoners of conscience. The government officially claims that it has no political prisoners. However, NGOs and international media have reported that Bahrain holds approximately 1,200 prisoners of conscience, most of them in Jaw Central Prison. Charges against them include terrorism, which has a broad and ambiguous definition in Bahraini law, treason, espionage, and attempting to overthrow the monarchy. Many prisoners claim severe violations of due process for their cases, such as having no access to a lawyer or being coerced into providing a false confession under torture. Among the remaining prisoners of conscience.
Sorry, Andrew, for interruption. Just if you can wrap up within a minute to be on time to give we will give you another opportunity later on if you want to continue other points that we couldn't cover now. Thank you.
Among the remaining prisoners of conscience are opposition leaders and human rights activists such as Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, Abdul Jalil al-Singase, Hassan Mushema, and Sheikh Ali Salman. In 2012, then U.S. President Barack Obama publicly commented that as long as these leaders remain imprisoned for their political views in Bahrain, dialogue and by implication, reform are impossible. This essentially continues to have major roadblocks that we see into reform in the country. And it is Salam DHR's recommendation that Bahrain release all political prisoners, including human rights defenders and opposition activists, in accordance with the ICCPR, that it repeal laws restricting freedom of expression and peaceful assembly to ensure compliance with Articles 19, 21, and 22 of the ICCPR, that it lift political bans, including the political isolation law, and that it must end the use of excessive force against peaceful protesters and the invasion of privacy via spyware. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Andrew. Definitely very, very clear visions over all these grave human rights violations. I think the rest of the colleague, they will elaborate in more details on each these violations that you already mentioned. We'll go now to Berlin with our colleague, Sayyid Youssef Al-Muhafda. He is a Bahraini human rights defender, a senior human rights defenders who are engaged on the so many cases related to the human rights violations in Gulf, and at the same time, specifically, he carried on defending the victims in the different types of the international human rights gathering with the engagement with the UN mechanism. And he is a very specialized in his field through his study on masters on human rights. We welcome Sayyid Youssef Al-Muhafda, who is speaking on behalf of HUMINA, and I believe he's going to represent a report that he drafted with the engagement and cooperation with HUMINA with regards of the history of the UPR of Bahrain and different stations that and cyclic review of the UPR of Bahrain has been done since started 2008 till now. Yes, Sayyid Youssef, and please try to be within 8 to 9 minutes, please. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Jawad, for the introduction. And of course, thank you for inviting me to speak about this important event and about the topic of the UPR in Bahrain. As you have just mentioned, I have recently authored a report about Bahrain non-compliance with UPR recommendation, and the time frame of my report is 2008 until 2024, which document the full cycle since Bahrain has engaged in this mechanism until now. And the report will be published, hopefully, inshallah, this week with HUMINA for Human Rights and Civic Engagement. and we will share it in our social media, and I will try to send it all of you. But in my intervention today, I would like just to focus on the finding of the report, and I think this will be helpful for this event. So the report demonstrates that the government of Bahrain has accepted the majority of the recommendation outlined in its 4 cycles between 2008 and 2022. While some recommendations have been implemented, it is concerning that the most critical one have not been addressed. Bahrain voluntary commitment to UPR mechanism does not align with its action within its local legislation or the protection of citizen and migrant rights in Bahrain. Bahrain asserted that several recommendations are inconsistent with the application of Sharia, and they are incompatible with national laws or require further study. And I think, in my opinion, also that the ratification of UN Convention by Bahrain does not currently signify a commitment to comply with the human rights law. Rather, it demonstrates that the country has attained the standard of modern state within the context of international community. The report finding indicate also that the lack of political will, the absence of genuine pressure from major Western power, and the absence of UN enforcement tools have collectively contributed to Bahrain non-compliance with UPR recommendation and human rights law. Bahrain also lack of effective democratic institution and the king absolute power have resulted in decreased compliance with UPR recommendation, which represent a significant obstacle to human rights reform and compliance with UPR recommendation. Also, I think this is one of my opinion, and also one of the finding of the report, that pragmatic approach of many Western countries, coupled with the reduction in public criticism directed towards their allies and due to economic and political interests, has encouraged Bahrain to refrain from fully complying with UPR recommendation. Bahrain also has employed a range of repressive measures, not only to silence domestic criticism and reformers, but also to reduce criticism on the international stage. Bahrain has developed many strategies to reduce international pressure using its diplomatic relation, strategic location in Bahrain, public relation, PR company, and established many government bodies. It's also regrettable that Bahrain human rights body lack of any meaningful authority such as the NIHR and ombudsman. And also the absence of functional democratic mechanism and tools coupled with the dynamics or the dynamic of intelligence, I mean the national security apparatus over the judiciary and public prosecution also has resulted in non-compliance with the human rights law. And also, finally, also the lack of judiciary independence is another cause of Bahrain non-compliance with the UPR recommendation. I'll give some concrete example. The right of freedom of assembly associated and association is also subjected to restrictive measure in Bahrain. The right of freedom of assembly is subjected to restriction following amendment that prevent individual from protesting, for example, in capital Manama. This is in a decree called 2013 decree, which impose a limitation on the practice of this right. Another example is freedom of press. It's also international journalists are facing legal limitation that restrict their work. Also, local journalists are also facing restriction that prevent independent journalists from practicing freely. And also one of the main example are the closure of Al-Wasat newspaper, and it was a clear indicator of broader restriction on a free press. Additionally, for example, the freedom of expression is also restricted. Many individuals have been affected by these restrictive measures. And as a result of these measures, Bahrain has suspended and dissolved many civil society, and also board member of civil society are banned from running for a parliament following this restrictive amendment to the political rights. And also, consequently, any individual who has previously been a member of dissolved society cannot be a board member in any civil society. So the arbitrary laws has created a situation where individuals have been deprived of their political rights. Just to summarize, also the rights of freedom of expression. I mean, the social media engagement, for example, if you criticize the government or the king, you could be charged for inciting hatred or insulting the monarchy, and also some Bahraini anti-terrorist provision contradict with also international human rights law. This provision allows of capital punishment and revocation of nationality. This is also a stark violation of international human rights law. Finally, this example of a human rights violation I have just mentioned demonstrate that Bahrain is not in compliance with UPR recommendation through its restrictive measures and limitation on many fundamental rights, despite Bahrain's status as a signatory to many international treaties. I mean, UN international treaties, but the result that there is a notable lack of compliance with international norms and recommendation to Bahrain human rights commitment. I will speak later about the recommendation on the second stage. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sayyid Yusuf Al-Muhafdha, and highly appreciating that you stick with the time. And as I indicated, you will get another chance to elaborate some other points. For sure, it is so clear that even Bahrain is claiming that they are having national human rights action plan, and there are so many so-called intergovernmental human rights bodies like embassies and National Institute for Human Rights and so on. But still, we can see through whatever is being given as a clear evidence by Andrew and by Sayyid Yusuf, Bahrain is far away to respect all these major human rights types of the Palestinian concern. We now go to our third speaker. We welcome Hala Ahad. She is a prominent Jordanian lawyer and human rights lawyer, mainly defending so many victims on the basic human rights. She's defending women's rights, workers' rights, and freedom of opinion, expressions, and peaceful assembly. She engaged in a lot of regional and international human rights events, expressing and defending the human rights. She headed the legal committee of the Jordanian Women's Union and continues to defend women's victims. She is also a member of the lawyers team for National Forum for the Defense of Liberties. We welcome you, Hala, and glad that you are joining us. And we like to hear from you how you evaluate the women's right in Bahrain, particularly the rights of Bahraini mothers to pass their nationality to their children. Please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank you, Mr. Jawad, and thank Salam Organization for inviting me to this webinar. In my intervention, as you mentioned, I will address women's rights in Bahrain's UPR and examine how the accepted recommendation align with actual progress towards women's rights. In a review of the recommendation presented to Bahrain shows that all of them, whether accepted or noted, concerns women's rights. This includes recommendation related to equality and non-discrimination, ratification of international conventions, civil society participation, education and empowerment, human rights defenders, and freedom of expression. Bahrain, like Jordan, my country, when it comes to women's rights, accepts general and vague recommendations, but don't accept more specific ones. If we look deeper, we can see the specific recommendation Bahrain accepted regarding women's rights. For example, when it's come to advocate housing, Bahrain accepted one recommendation. And girls' access to education accepted also one recommendation. In discrimination against women accepted 5 recommendations. In women's empowerment, 7 recommendations. women's participation in political and public life, 10 recommendations, violence against women, 3 recommendations, right to nationality, 7 recommendations, domestic workers' rights, 2 recommendations. On other hand, Bahrain noted and we can say effectively rejected critical recommendations, including raise the legal age of marriage, achieving full equality in family law, decriminalizing abortion, criminalizing sexual violence and marital rape, and lifting reservation on CEDAW. A review of the recommendations highlights serious gaps in women's rights and demonstrates how Bahrain's selective acceptance of certain recommendations reflects either a commitment to ending discrimination against women or a decision to maintain existing human rights violation. For example, while Bahrain accepted some recommendations related to nationality laws and anti-discrimination measures, it rejected the essential recommendation to amend the nationality law, which would have allowed Bahraini women to pass their nationality to their children. If we look to the state of the women's right in Bahrain, it becomes clear that a violation persists. I will, in my intervention, highlight some key examples. For example, when we talk about citizenship and nationality rights, the Bahraini constitution states that all citizens are equal. Yet the nationality law denies women the right to pass their nationality to their children. As a result of that, many children are denied access to basic rights, including a right to education, right to public health, and at risk of statelessness and social stigma. When we talk about advocate housing, which Bahrain accepted one recommendation about it, while the housing law was amended to include women, Bahraini women married to foreign nationals are excluded unless they have minor children who hold Bahraini nationality. The legal framework permits girls to marry at 16 and even younger with court approval. And we talk about family law and guardianship. Women's right to divorce, which called in the law khulu', remains restricted, requiring the husband's consent, which undermines women's right to end marriage. Additionally, a woman's freedom to choose a spouse is conditional on the guardian's approval, and mothers are denied financial guardianship over their children, which is instead given to the grandfather. In political participation, as I mentioned before, Bahrain accepted 10 recommendations, but still Bahraini women who were members of dissolved political associations face exclusion and restrictions that ban them from running
political participation,
elected councils, effectively stripping them of their constitutional right to participate in political right. The domestic violence protection law lacks penalties for offenders. It does not impose sanctions for violation of protection orders, which are only issued after violence occurs. Furthermore, the law fails to tackle the threats as an offense. It does not recognize threats of violence as an offense. Ultimately, women's rights cannot be separated from the broader state of freedoms and human rights in Bahrain, especially what Andrew and Sayed mentioned before. There is a clear contradiction between the recommendations Bahrain has accepted and the reality on the ground. While we hope Bahrain will fully implement the recommendation it has accepted and accept the noted recommendation, its rejection of key recommendations such as those related to nationality rights, child marriage, gender-based violence, and full legal equality raises serious concerns about its genuine commitments to advancing women's rights. I don't want to يعني to wish sound I don't want to wish or to be pessimistic, but Bahrain's rejections of essential recommendations mean that legal discrimination against women will persist, child marriage will remain legal, Bahraini women's children will continue to be denied their mother nationality and basic rights, and violence against women will remain tolerated without effective penalties. If real change is to be achieved, Bahrain must align its laws with international human standards and take concrete steps toward eliminating all forms of discrimination and violence against women. And of course, this is need essential civil intervene from civil society and international community and human rights to continue pushing for these rights, pushing for accountability and meaningful legal reforms to ensure that women's rights in Bahrain are not just discussed in reviews, but fully realized in practice. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Highly appreciated, Hala, for this in-depth analysis of the, in general, women's and children's right, and specifically the issue with related to the nationality role and identity, and which is led to the stateless of the women's or the newborn children, and then they've been deprived of the basic rights due to that, and so many other examples that you elaborated, Wally. Definitely will come back to you later on to focus over particular cases, and maybe some questions will be raised here. Now, our fourth panelist is Said Falah Said. She is representing a MENA Rights Group, an expert on her field of presenting in-depth reports and analyzing follow-up the human rights violations in MENA regions in the Gulf, and follow-up many cases related to Bahrain, proudly with Salam and other partners. MENA Rights Group, they've been part of the Midterm UPR report, and recently they got involved on the revocations of nationalities in Kuwait, and today a joint statement on that regard has been issued too. I believe Falah will focus mainly of assessments of the intergovernmental bodies, bringing the example of National Institute of Human Rights to indicate that how is being functioned and is it within the Paris Principle or not. Yes, please go ahead, Falah.
Thank you so much, Jawad, and thank you to all the panelists. I think it's perfect for me to start speaking on the National Human Rights Institution at this point, because I see that, the previous panelists have given a very exhaustive painting of the human rights situation in Bahrain and UPR recommendations. And the question is now how to implement these recommendations that were accepted, or how to act on changing those who were refused. And one of the ways that usually implementation happens is through the impulse of national human rights institutions. So maybe just to set the ground, before delving into the Bahraini National Human Rights Institution, I think it's important to just understand the role of a national human rights institution, especially the role in safeguarding human rights and the role in the UPR. National human rights institutions, or NHRIs, are supposed to be independent bodies that are established to protect and to promote human rights within their national borders. their functions, as you said, Jawad, are outlined in the United Nations Paris Principles. These institutions are responsible for monitoring the human rights situation, addressing individual complaints, and basically just holding the government accountable for violations and advising on legal reforms to align national laws with their international human rights obligations. And for that purpose, NHRIs must be independent from all branches of government. They must be pluralistic in their representation, and they must also be effective. They must have an effective mandate to address human rights violations. They are also expected to, collaborate with civil society organizations to enhance the legitimacy and impact of their work. And in the context of the UPR, NHRIs are really important because they can submit reports ahead of the UPR and to, expose the human rights situation in a country. But after a UPR, they can also, they should also follow up on the recommendations that were accepted to ensure that these recommendations are effectively implemented. And they should, suggest drafts of legal reforms, on women's rights, on children's rights, on all the issues that Hala has been speaking about. And they should also follow up on individual complaints, visit prisons, visit detention centers, visit political prisoners. This is what an NHRI should be doing. Unfortunately, the Bahraini NHRI has fallen short of that. There is a Bahraini NHRI. The Bahraini government established it in 2009, with the aim of fostering a human rights culture and promoting the protection of fundamental freedom. But unfortunately, its effectiveness has, long been called into question. And as part, of there has been an evaluation process for this NHRI by a subcommittee for accreditation, which is basically an institution that falls under the GANRI, which is the Global Alliance for National Human Rights Institutions. And there is like a committee that basically assesses the effectiveness and the independence of NHRIs. And this committee, this subcommittee on accreditation has assessed has re-accredited or has assessed the Bahraini NHRI in October 2024. And the subcommittee on accreditation, or the SCA, reviewed the NHRI of Bahrain, its adherence to the Paris Principles, so whether it respects the Paris Principles. And the SCA's assessment resulted in a decision to maintain or to give the Bahraini NHRI status B, which basically signifies that the institution is partially compliant with the Paris Principle, meaning that it is partially independent or partially effective. This re-accreditation is not a failure because there are 3 statuses, A, B, and C. So B is just partial compliance, but it does indicate that there is, a serious gap in the institution's operation. And these gaps must be addressed so that the recommendation of the UPR are effectively implemented. And the SCA, the SCA re-accreditation process highlighted some key issues. I'm going to highlight 4 key issues that has been highlighted by the SCA, which is first of all, the lack of independence of the Bahraini NHRI. The SCA found that the Bahraini NHRI still suffers from insufficient independence from the government because the selection process of its leadership, which is is basically heavily influenced by the ruling government, and it's raises serious concerns about the institution's impartiality and autonomy in carrying out its mandates. There is also a second key issue that was highlighted is the limited engagement with civil society. The SCA noted that the Bahraini NHRI does not engage at all. It does not engage with Salam, with the Bahraini institutions or other organizations in Bahrain. The third key issue that was highlighted by the SCA is the ineffective monitoring and reporting. The Bahraini NHRI has been criticized because of its lack of effective monitoring of human rights violations, particularly in places of detention, such as prisons. There has been no regular unannounced visits to prisons, and we have never seen, comprehensive reports on human rights abuses that have occurred in the country. A fourth key issue is a failure to address key human rights violations. We see that, the SCA expressed concern that the Bahraini NHRI failed to address high-profile human rights violations, such as, the ongoing arbitrary detention of Abdelhadi Al-Khawaja or Abdel Jalil Singasi. So we see that there are clear shortcomings in this international human rights institution, which leads us to kind of doubt that they will take steps to, draft legal reforms, draft laws, or just push the government to implement their accepted recommendations. Maybe I don't know how much time I have left, Jawad.
Less than a minute.
Okay, then I'm just going to end here, and maybe we can go further a bit later on, recommendations for reform to the NHRI.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Falah. And so clearly you focused on a clear example of intergovernmental human rights bodies, which indicates that it is couldn't function independently. It is so much following the path of the governmental instructions, and it is not that much in the standard of the Paris Principle, naming that there are so many similar intergovernmental, like embassments, prisons, commissioners unit, and we have a special investigation unit and so on. But unfortunately, all these are just names without practicing their mandates or try to defending mainly the victims' rights. We hope so this wrong pattern will change, and to be given full rights for these institutes to defend the victims and to be within the standards of the international standards, and they can prove that they are totally practicing to defend the human rights, to defend the victim rights, to be not repeating or echoing the governmental sounds and positions. Okay, our fifth, before the last one, is the Ghana Arbai. She is representing Bahrain Forum for Human Rights. Reba been involved on the issue of the human rights in Bahrain in average of 10 decades and a decade time. Since long, she is following up the case of Bahrain and presenting a lot of research and engaged on a regional international event to focus over the human rights conditions in Bahrain. I welcome you, Ghana, from Beirut, and I believe possibly you can focus over the issue of the discrimination within the different communities in Bahrain, especially related to the oppressions and the types of the religious freedoms, how you evaluate it, and if there is any persecution, religious persecutions being imposed on the certain types of the sectarian minorities or majorities in Bahrain community. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Jawad. Good evening for everyone. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to participate in this assessment for the midterm UPR on Bahrain. I will be focusing on the subject of interfaith and religious persecution in Bahrain, mainly during the period since the last UPR session on Bahrain, which occurred on the 7th of November 2022 until today. So I will not be focusing on the long history of persecution of religious rights in Bahrain. In the UPR 2022, 7 recommendations that Bahrain supported focused on religious freedoms in Bahrain, calling for the promotion of interfaith dialogue and religious tolerance, for ensuring equal rights of all persons to freedom of religion without discrimination or undue restrictions, to consolidate the values and principles of religious tolerance and peaceful coexistence among religions to enhance national unity, and to respect the freedoms of expression and association in regard to religious rights. According to the daily monitoring carried out by the Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, our statistics show that during the period between the 7th of November 2022 and the date of the last UPR, that is the date of the last UPR, until now, February 2025, the Bahraini authorities arbitrarily detained 14 religious figures. 11 of them were clerics, 2 religious chanters, which in Bahrain they're known in the term radud, and a chairman of a religious institution known as Husayniya or Ma'tam in Bahrain. And it also arbitrarily summoned for interrogations 25 religious figures. 20 of them were clerics, 4 religious chanters, and 1 chairman of a religious institution, all of whom attribute to the Shia religious sect, which forms the majority of the Bahraini people. These religious figures were detained and interrogated for reasons related to the continuous targeting of the Ashura annual occasion that the Shia sect commemorate annually, or for arranging celebrations for the release of prisoners of conscience, or for reasons related to freedom of speech and expression, such as condemning the Israeli atrocities on Gaza, or for supporting the Palestinian and Lebanese people who were facing Israeli aggression, or condemning the Bahraini official normalization with Israel while delivering their speeches in mosques or during commemorations. One of the most prominent violations against freedom of religious rights that the Bahraini authorities committed during the aforementioned period is forbidding the practice of the Friday central prayer for the Shia sect for 19 consecutive weeks, starting from the 4th of October 2024 until Friday last week, for the main reason that after people finish praying, they march and demonstrate peacefully in support for Gaza and Lebanon. And the Bahraini authorities persecuted with force and with tear gas 2 peaceful protests that were held. One that was a protest against the decision to forbid the Friday prayers, and the other protest was for the arbitrary imprisonment of the cleric Ali al-Sadadi, who was imprisoned for a speech that he delivered on a Friday prayer in support of Gaza and Lebanon. Moreover, in Jau Central Prison, the prison administration imposed restrictions on practicing the religious ritual of Ashura occasion for all prisoners of conscience in general, but utterly deprived the 12 prisoners of conscience who are sentenced to capital punishment from participating in the practice of Ashura, which prompted those 12 prisoners of conscience to protest through a hunger strike, for which the prison administration responded with depriving them from the right to phone calls with their families. Also, a prison officer named Malala prohibited prisoners of conscience from practicing the Eid al-Adha prayer and was not held accountable. Those aforementioned violations of human rights are not the only cases of arbitrary detention, persecution of peaceful protests, prison violations against POCs and so on, but they are the violations that particularly target religious figures and religious practices of the Shia sect, which, as I mentioned, forms the majority of the Bahraini citizens. Anyway, also on October 2022, that is 1 month prior to the UPR cycle on Bahrain, Bahraini associations and human rights organizations sent detailed reports to the Committee in the Elimination of Racial Discrimination about the political isolation and discrimination against the Shia sect specifically, stipulating in details how the Shia citizens in general are deprived from forming political associations and how such former associations were dissolved, and how high-ranking official positions and decision-making positions are mostly appointed to people other than Shia, except for a few positions appointed to Shia families that are loyal to the ruling dynasty. No reforms whatsoever were made in this regard since the release of those reports in October 2022. All of the aforementioned facts and events contradict the UPR recommendations that were approved by Bahrain on the subject of interfaith and religious freedoms. They also contradict the report made by the Bahraini Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was released last September 2024, about the implementations of the UPR fourth cycle recommendations, in which the ministry emphasizes that the Bahraini government implement equality among people of all religions, implement freedom of association and peaceful assembly with no prejudice, and I quote, with no prejudice to the foundation of religion. Also implement freedom to practice religion, religious rituals for prisoners. And under the title in the report, under the title, and I will quote the title name, continue to spread the culture of interfaith dialogue and promote a culture of peaceful coexistence and religious freedom. Under this title, the ministry dedicates 2 big paragraphs to explain how the government respects religious freedoms, tolerance, and unity, wherein, on the other hand, the government's actions still fail to implement those rights and still fail to hold accountable official personnel who violate those rights. Thank you very much for listening, and thank you again for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Ghana. Very rich and so clear about the evaluation of the interfaith in Bahrain and how the claim of the authorities that there is freedom of the expressions, whether related to the different beliefs, or how the issue of the discrimination among different faith believers, especially those who are part of the Shia school of thought in Bahrain. I will come back to you later on our second round. Now, my last panelist in this cycle is Diwanish Vance. I'm sorry if I cannot pronounce your first name so perfectly. She is presenting Bahrain Human Rights Center. Bahrain Human Rights Center is one of those human rights entities in Bahrain which is banned since 2006 till now. And even the previous president or director of the center has been jailed sometimes back, Nabil Rajab. Diwanshi, she is master's in ALLM, and she is following up the issue of the human rights and got some experience with the different international and regional bodies and entities. I'm believing that she's going to give us a general evaluation from point of view of Bahrain Center for Human Rights on how they evaluate the human rights conditions in Bahrain. Please welcome Diwanshi, and please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Jawad, and I hope I'm audible enough to all of you. Greetings to all the panelists, and I really appreciate how every panelist has put a comprehensive evaluation of human rights in Bahrain. By the end of 2024, there have been some improvements in the situation of Bahrain, but still Bahrain Center for Human Rights expresses its deep concern over the continued and the systematic violations of human rights in Bahrain. Despite there are some releases of political prisoners, the country continues to witness a troubling decline in fundamental freedoms, including the freedom of assembly, expression, press, religion. And Bahraini authorities, they persist in their policies of discrimination, especially against women, children, and vulnerable communities. There is a dark reality of closure and shrinking of the civic space in Bahrain, and also maintaining a sort of a pressure on human rights defenders. Despite Bahraini women, as we all know, the brunt of the oppression and the repression is usually faced by women, by children, by the groups of vulnerable communities. Despite Bahraini women excelling in education, outnumbering and outperforming in school and university graduations, they face systematic discrimination in the labor market. Women are rarely seen in the leadership positions, in the managerial positions, even after they equally qualify for the same position. This rightly and blatantly is the violation of the Article 26 of the ICCPR, which prohibits non-discrimination on base of race, religion, gender. The disparity contradicts the people of equal opportunity and reflects deep-rooted discrimination that prevents women from accessing their full rights as guaranteed under the international human rights law. And as also one of the fellow panelists, Hala, said that Bahraini women are still denied the right to pass their nationality to their children, unlike Bahraini men, which is a clear violation on parts of discrimination. Children born to Bahraini mothers and foreign fathers face obstacles in accessing education, healthcare, and other essential resources. This policy constitutes a blatant form of gender-based discrimination and also violates Bahrain's obligations under both ICCPR and the CEDAW. When we talk about discrimination, there's also a discrimination which Guyana recently just emphasized on, which is the discrimination of Shia community on the basis of their practices, religious practices. There have been instances which I'm not going to repeat in detail since Guyana has already said it, where the clerics were arbitrarily detained, they were arrested, they were questioned, which is also the violation of Article 9 of ICCPR, which prevents arbitrary detention of persons. And there have been continuous violation of press freedom in Bahrain, which is severely restricted, severely censored. There is a tight control of the Bahraini authorities over the media, journalists and bloggers, and new social media independence journalism faces a lot of prosecution, intimidation, and harassment, often forcing them into sort of a self-censorship to avoid any sort of reprisal. This state of fear and control also creates a general environment of fear and mistrust between public, government, civic societies, and all of the elements that play a major role in a state. And further on, I would like to also, since we are talking about the freedom of press, we also have to talk about how there is arbitrary detention of some of the political prisoners. Abdul Al-Khwaja, who has been subjected to severe medical neglect in detention, is at risk of life-threatening health complications, and BCHR renews its demand for the immediate release of Abdul Hadi Al-Khwaja and other political prisoners, which have been in prison for a long time, and even the basic need of medical is neglected, medical emergencies and medical is neglected. Furthermore, there is also, after the lot of international criticism, Bahrain continues to arrest and detain children on charges related to their participation in peaceful protests, Throughout 2024, Bahraini authorities detained children as young as 15 years old, subjecting them to unsafe detention conditions and denying them education and psychological support. The detention of children violates Bahrain's obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of Children, which calls for the protection of children's rights to education, development, and a safe environment. This alarming trend demands urgent international attention and intervention. Where I still have time left, Jawad?
You have less than a minute, so you can wrap up, please.
Yeah, I would like to wrap up my recommendations in the next round, and I would like to thank all the panelists and Jawad for giving me this opportunity.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And so comprehensive with a clear indication that unfortunately all these promotive of the PR through Bahrain engagement with the different international convention indicating that Bahrain is right track with regards of the human rights reforms. It's clear that it is untrue, and at the same time we can see that still a grave human rights violation still is unsolved, and it's required seriously a very serious political will to be in the way of the applying and implementing the major recommendation being forwarded to Bahrain through different human rights committees, through UPR recommendations, and at the same time whatever engagement Bahrain had with OHCHR and so on. I think from now till 25 minutes we have, there are few questions is being forwarded to me from the audience and some other participants. I will go the same cycle. I will forward the first question to Dr. Andrew, and next one to be to Said Youssef, then to Falah. The first question is to you, Dr. Andrew. What are the biggest human rights challenges currently facing Bahrain? If you can just indicate the major challenges facing Bahrain right away, and what your recommendation to find solution to these challenges.
Certainly, it really depends on how you want to quantify human rights violations. The most immediate is likely the continued mistreatment of prisoners of conscience. As my colleagues have rightly pointed out, figures like Abdulnami al-Khawaja are in life-threatening condition due to medical neglect that they have received. It has been more or less shown repeatedly that the Bahraini government has no particular interest in releasing these men. And they have done this really by releasing as many other people as possible, essentially to signal that they are attempting to engage in reforms. Yet, despite this, really the most important figures in Bahraini politics and in human rights activism remain behind bars. Even forms of compromise with al-Khawaja saying more or less that he could be released and deported to Denmark have not been acceptable to the Bahraini government. That being said, even outside of Bahraini prisons, we have continuous issues. We see very much a vice closing when it comes to freedom of expression and free media. Rather than becoming less repressive, we have seen the government grow increasingly so. As where we see mediums of communication and expression policed on an unprecedented scale, especially over the past year, as we've seen in relation to the war in Gaza and in Lebanon. We've seen civil society close tremendously, and this places everyone at risk. As rather than releasing prisoners, we see the risk of more people entering Bahraini prisons, the exact opposite of what we had hoped for. The ways in which we can work on this are complicated, particularly when we look at the decrease in civil society, and lacks of checks and balances in the government are one of the main things that enable this. Moreover, we have long worked with foreign governments to place pressure on Bahrain because they tend to respond positively to that when their allies in the United States and United Kingdom do so. Unfortunately, one of the things we see right now in the United States is that we see a centralization of power occurring right there. It's like limiting the power of civil society. In the UK, we unfortunately see a degree of hesitancy when it comes to criticizing the Bahraini government. Some of the best ways that we have in which to do this are to increase media attention on Bahrain, to get normal people involved. That's been one of the main obstacles that we have seen. We've seen in the United Kingdom, when people get involved, that they care. We have representatives in the United States, like Marco Rubio, who has long championed human rights in Bahrain. It's about getting the right people involved, drumming up public support, and being sure that that can reflect on governments as like for influence, as like for pressure, and also doing that through global mechanisms such as the United Nations.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. The next question to you, Said Youssef. You've been involved in an excellent report with regards to the revocation of nationality in Bahrain. Can you give us a brief about this issue, which is being impacted over former MPs, political oppositions, human rights defenders, some women, and so on? If you just, with 2 to 3 minutes, you can give us a little bit brief on the revocation of nationalities in Bahrain. Said Youssef?
Yes, of course. But would I have another stage, or that will be the last one? I have just, or this is
Okay. This question you can reply it, but then you can make another comments that you want to add to it, because this is going to be our last cycle that you can make a contribution from your side.
okay. So okay. Yeah, because I have just some recommendation about the from the in relation to the UPR. But
okay, you answer the question, then you can make the recommendation of the UPR, please. Make it now 4 minutes, 2 minutes each.
Yes. All right. Yes. So I mean, as you have mentioned, recently I drafted, wrote a report about the impact of the stateless in Bahrain on belonging and identity, and I have also demonstrated how this revocation of stateless in Bahrain have resulted in in a stateless inside Bahrain and also stateless outside Bahrain, which is a clear violation to the international law. And yes, the government or the King of Bahrain has restored some of these of those people nationality who have been revoked, but until now there are around more than 400, around 440 if I around 440 individuals in Bahrain, inside Bahrain and outside Bahrain, nationality were revoked, and that's something very worrying. And it showed you, it showed the international community and also the observer how the government is using the revocation of nationality as a tool of repression, as long with many other repression tools, and even using the death penalty as a repression, for example, as a tool of repression. Unfortunately, yes, that was a clear, the use of revoking nationality is a clear example of persecution, and also persecution of people who has a different point of view, who have been only their nationality were revoked because of their human rights activism or political words, or some of them are journalists, writer, activists, and a human rights defender, and there is nothing can justify revoking of nationality. But yes, this is the current situation. The other 2 minutes, I think I will speak about the later on the recommendation.
Okay, thanks. I'll come back to you before we end. I can ask you, Falah, until we can. The next one will be to Hala. Falah, here a question that: do government actually listen to these recommendations whatsoever? Human rights communities recommendations, UPR recommendations, or any types of the recommendations forwarded to Bahrain or demanded through special rapporteurs and so on. So how you evaluate the Bahrain performance toward these recommendations on the international human rights committees?
Thank you so much, Jawad. And of course, for the UPR, it's a peer review process. So a lot of it is based on, diplomacy and what they diplomatically want to accept or not accept, and what goes against their sovereignty, what doesn't go against their sovereignty, and how they want to, to make their place in the human rights field. So a lot of it is about negotiations and such. But of course, I mean, when it comes to human rights committees, when it comes to UPR reviews, to reviews from treaty bodies, it's important to ensure that there is an independent institution inside the country that, you know, will push the government to implement whether it's recommendations from treaty body committees, recommendations from UPR, whether it's opinions from the working group, or communications from UN special procedures, but there has to be an institution inside the country that, you know, pushes the government towards that. And for now, as I said before, there isn't. The institution, the National Human Rights Institution, is not capable of bringing that kind of push to the government. And we have, you know, established some recommendations for reform. And I think one of the very first things to ensure that the institution will be able to push for that is to enhance its independence. So, you know, change the selection process of the National Human Rights Institution and ensure that it is merit-based, transparent, and, you know, independent from political influence. We should also aim to, you know, improve its effectiveness, to investigate human rights violations. And, you know, I think that the National Human Rights Institution should also strengthen its engagement with civil society, because it's only civil society that's going to bring them, you know, an independent, you know, or a real aspect of the human rights situation. And also it's important that the National Human Rights Institution, you know, just ensure accountability of the National Human Rights Institution. And it must take a stronger stance on human rights violations committed by state actors, and also hold perpetrators accountable. So yeah, again, I reiterate my call to, you know, ensure that there is an independent institution that will give that push to the government to apply the recommendations that were accepted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hala, another question is being raised, that's how you evaluate the international pressure over Bahrain to improve the human rights conditions. Did you feel that such campaigns, advocacy, and political pressure, either by allies, by international communities, being imposed in Bahrain or demanded Bahrain to improve the human rights conditions? Did you see such movement is impacting over Bahrain, and how you evaluate Bahrain response? Hala? You are muted. Can you remove the mute? Okay. Go ahead. I can hear you. No? No, sorry, we cannot hear you. No. Okay. Maybe I can come back to you. Maybe I can come back to you. You please check the voice. Now, maybe I can ask you, Diwanshi, then I can go back to Rena later on. Diwanshi, there's a question that through the audience and activist point of view, is there anything that you are recommending to raise awareness and to defend the rights of the human rights in Bahrain? What is your recommendation, and what you recommend these people that to join these campaigns and to spread the awareness about the human rights violations in Bahrain? What is your recommendations? Then I go back to you, Rana, after Diwani. Yes, Diwanchi, yes.
So I'll be speaking from the perspective of an activist. Obviously, there is scope of international call. There's scope for international pressure by the allied countries and also by the various organizations and civic bodies. But most of the protests and most of the campaigns that can also start with student-run NGOs or organizations or students studying in universities, as seen in a lot of countries. We have recently seen in the case of Bangladesh and Myanmar, where in Bangladesh, the dictatorship has been overturned by the protests of the students. And there should be a constant awareness and campaigning about human rights. What are the fundamental rights, and how can a person or how can an individual living in a state should be aware of their own fundamental. There should be program run for legal literacy, where there's education about the universal and the fundamental rights. There should be legal literacy about all the conventions that Bahrain has signed on an international level, such as CEDAW, ICCPR. So in my opinion, it should also come from not just the civic bodies, but also individually from the people of Bahrain, collectively. And students and voices of universities also are very important in changing and overturning the situations.
Thanks a lot to you, Rena. There is a question that since the beginning of this UPR cycle, which started to 2008, now we are on the fourth cycle, which happened 2022, 2008, 2012, 2017, and then 2022. Did you find any tangible changes in the ground with these types of the cycle, which is Bahrain is considered to improve the human rights conditions since then? Can you focus over your evaluation of how human rights is being improved with regards of the recommendation given to Bahrain through the UPR cycle?
Okay, so to be objective here, because the focus here is not on the violations that are going on, but also we have to light upon any reforms that would happen. But since now we are commemorating the beginning of the crisis in Bahrain that began in 2011, 14 February 2011, here I would like to remind of something. Since the beginning of this humanitarian crisis, which was actually a result of a political crisis, no radical changes has happened to solve this issue, to solve this crisis. Thousands of political prisoners in prison. This is indeed a crisis. So there have been, to say that there has not been any reforms at all, there have been minor reforms, releasing some prisoners of conscience, making programs in prisons, such as open prisons programs, and so on. But as a prisoner of conscience gets released, another citizen gets arbitrarily detained. So we can objectively analyze here that the Bahraini government is trying its best to show to the international community as a defender of human rights and so on. But the truth is that there has never been any radical changes and meaning effective changes to change the whole situation that is going on in Bahrain. What Bahrain needs right now in order for there to be an actual change is transitional justice, which requires compensation, which requires the stop of all violations, which requires releasing all prisoners of conscience immediately and without any recommendations, without demanding anything from them. And there has the perpetrators has to be held accountable. Until that, all these steps are taken, we cannot say that the UPR recommendations were actually effectively implemented as they should be. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this answer. Okay, two last question. Now back to you, Said Youssef, then I will end up with you, Andrew, to wrap up, and then we can end today our webinar. So Said Youssef, you have to give us a little bit further recommendation that you are proposing to all stakeholders, let me say, if possible, to Bahrain allies, to Bahrain government, to activists, and normally to the human rights defenders and so on. If you can, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I would focus on the government of Bahrain because in 2 minutes I cannot make it. But
okay.
Anyways, I mean, yes, Bahrain has done yes, of course, some positive steps, you know, in complying with the human rights and sustainable development. environment and economic rights and some migrant rights with limitation, but mainly they have ignored the civil and political rights, and that's the main problem also, or one of the main problems. So I think my recommendation will be, that all of these torture allegations should be subjected through independent investigation, especially also on the international level, not also in local level, which I mean a UN mechanism. So and also we demand that the release of all the prisoner of conscience and all those who have been, this prisoner were confesses extracted under torture to be released, and also to the government of Bahrain to adopt legislation to ensure the redress and rehabilitation for the victims of torture and ill treatment, which I mean transitional justice should be implemented in Bahrain, and of course to commute all this sentence and also to restore their nationality to all those people who have been individual who has been nationality have been revoked, and also to ratify the optional protocol to the Convention of Torture, and also to allow with unconditional invitation to all UN special rapporteur in relation to different rapporteur, and also to prohibit the discrimination based on gender, sexual orientation, and identity, race, and age, and also, and finally, to permit independent human rights organization or political society to operate in Bahrain, which I mean to take away this political isolation law, and also allowed foreign journalists and local journalists to freely operate their work freely without consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and well said, and excellent recommendation being provided by you, Sayyid Youssef. We hopefully it's going to be a part of the priority of the agenda of Bahraini government of any vision or plan they're going to have from now onward. Last word to you, Andrew, if you can give us your impression of how you can see the further improvement of human rights conditions in Bahrain, and what else that you will add to the recommendations being given and presented by Sayyid Youssef. Just please make it within 2 minutes maximum.
Certainly. Unfortunately, when it comes to engaging in reforms with countries like Bahrain, they are highly dependent on international pressure. If international pressure is not going to be given, it has almost no incentive in which to do it. We've heard some excellent recommendations here about transitional justice. The problem with transitional justice is that it usually follows a revolution or essentially isolation from major backers and powers. Currently, there is no scenario for either of that in Bahrain. The people in charge have very little incentive in which to engage in reforms. The repressive tactics they use are specifically to prevent major reforms from occurring, because we are talking about a minoritarian government. It lives in fear of essentially giving people voices. What we have to do instead is essentially more circumspect. It's less circuitous. It has to do with creating influence campaigns. It has to do with convincing powerful countries that there is direct incentive in doing that, because essentially the system that remains in Bahrain at this time is ultimately destabilizing long term, and that they have been prioritizing short-term gains without really a major vision for the country's future. When we look at how we can add to recommendations in Bahrain, by far, is one of the most important things is to preserve fundamental freedoms that are not just promised in the ICCPR, of which Bahrain is a signatory, but they're also promised within the Bahraini constitution. One of the best ways that reform can begin in the country is by the powers that be deciding that they are going to actually engage in rule of law tactics. And this in itself will play a major role in stabilizing society and ultimately making repression less likely.
Thanks a lot, and thank you very much, Andrew. At the end of this webinar, once again, jointly, we hopeful that in near future we can see a very, very serious will by the Bahraini authorities to adopt a deep, meaningful, and practical visions toward improving the human rights conditions in Bahrain. And we can see that revision of the Bahrain Human Rights Action Plan to solve the grave human rights violations. And at the same time, it could be the beginning and first step toward the political reforms in this country. At the end, I like to thank all the our co-sponsors. I'd like to thank MENA Rights Group, HU MENA, Right Realization Center, Bahrain Human Rights Forum for being with us and coordinating to have this webinar. At the same time, a special thanks to all our panelists, starting with Sayyid Yusuf Al-Mahafza, Andrew McIntosh representing Salam DHR, thanks to Hala Ahed from Jordan, lawyer, thanks to Falah Saeed from MENA Rights Group, and thank you, Ghina Rabai from Bahrain Forum for Human Rights, and Tionchi, thank you, Dionchi, thank you a lot for your participation with us, representing Bahrain Center for Human Rights. And let us say that we can be actively engaged in another coming webinar with better human rights improvement in Bahrain. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Jawad. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.